talking about Jewish eschatology or Jewish chronology, and the basic premise of this subject matter is just this. When it comes to eschatology, all things eschatological, it's all about the Jews. And so if you want to understand the unfolding of the end times or how things will work toward that end, you have to be tuned in to what is going on with the Jews, what is happening to and through and around the Jews. Now, in talking about this specific subject, we are going to be looking at Daniel tonight, and these are the major features of Daniel. Some of this you've seen last week. I added a couple little things onto it just because I thought it was a little stark last week. So just to fill you in, these are the spots we're going to be visiting here in Daniel. We're not going to probably get down to the Olivet Discourse. Certainly won't get to the Apocalypse tonight. So let's just quickly recap these things. In Daniel chapter 2, we have this vision. A lot of times people don't think of it as an end time or eschatological vision, but it is. It's that way because it deals with this particular reality, what's going to happen to the Jews over time. Daniel, in that particular vision, it wasn't his own. It was actually King Nebuchadnezzar's vision. It was a dream that he had that troubled him. When he woke up, he was troubled, but he couldn't remember it. And so he called for all of the wise people to come and all the various magi, the various astrologers, the various kinds of people who might be able to interpret dreams and that kind of thing. And he told them that they not only needed to tell him his dream, but they needed to tell him what his dream meant. And they kept on saying to him, well, you tell us what your dream was, and we'll tell you what it meant. And he says, no, I know you guys are liars if you're pulling that one on me. No, you tell me what the dream was and what it meant. And no one could do it, but Daniel prayed about it. Daniel got a revelation from God. Daniel went in, and that's where the vision aspect that we have in Daniel chapter 2 comes out. Now, what that vision was all about, we'll talk about in a minute, but suffice it that the timeline that it was covering, and this is the thing that makes it particularly eschatological, the timeline that it was covering was from Nebuchadnezzar's time, and this is someplace after 605 BC, so maybe between 605 and 586, someplace in that framework, I would think. This is when Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest king on the earth as far as anyone knew, and it covers that time from that spot the whole way through history that is history for us, but for them it was prophetic, the whole way up to the coming of the Messiah. And because it covers that big span, and it gets from the state where Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel were, at a space and time when the Jews were basically being dispossessed, being, for the most part, cast asunder, and it brought into doubt whether or not there was any future for the Jews at all. God brings this vision and says this is what's going to be happening over time. And that's Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 7, the next big eschatological place in Daniel, that's a vision that's, for the most part, Daniel chapter 2 revisited. The imagery is a little different. So instead of a statue, you have animals. You have 4 different beasts. But really, to tell you the truth, those 4 different beasts actually mean the same things as the different makeup or material that was in the statues or the idol in Daniel chapter 2. The biggest thing about Daniel chapter 7 is that it's eschatological, not only because it covers the same kind of swath of time, but it develops a little more in that last kingdom that's coming. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but it develops a little bit more detail about the last kingdom that's coming, which is important because it's out of that kingdom that the Messiah, up here mentioned here, ends up coming out of. Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 was instead of like going forward or to adding anything else, it was really concentrating on a special segment of the history line that was developed in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 8, the bit of history that was concentrated on there was what what's going to happen after Babylon. That was the Persian era. But then quickly what happens to the Persians when the Greeks, big shaggy goat comes running across the land without barely touching the ground. The Greek period is important because it develops the Antiochian model. And when I say Antiochian model, that might sound like maybe we're talking about Antioch, where Paul ended up doing a lot of heavy ministry. I'm not. I'm talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus IV called himself Epiphanes, which means basically the manifested God. He was a Seleucid ruler. We'll talk a little bit more about this. I even got a little map. I couldn't find it at first, but then I ended up snagging it from the internet just before I came out here, so I was very happy to do that. Antiochus was a ruler in that particular line of rulers in the Seleucid Empire. And the important thing about him is that he ends up being a model for the Antichrist. And so when I say Antiochian model, what I mean is Antiochus as a model ultimately for the Antichrist. Daniel chapter 9 is important because Daniel chapter 9 is the one that really brings into focus the whole point of end times, the whole point of what's going on. God explains to Daniel in that particular passage through the angel Gabriel that God was not done with the Jews. God had work to do with them. And when he got done with the work that he was doing with the Jews, everything would be done. Sin would be taken care of. All things that were at odds between God and man would be taken care of. Everything was going to be finished when God got done doing what he was doing with the Jews. It's a very important concept, again, because we're talking eschatologically. What have I been saying? It's all about the Jews. And Daniel chapter 7, or Daniel chapter 9, really brings that into focus. Of course, the highlight of that is the vision of 77s. And we'll get into that as well. And then Daniel 11 and 12, that's talking about, this is kind of a throwback to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel 11 and 12 is a detail, it really reads like a newspaper. Or maybe a journal, or maybe even a chapter in a history book. Just detailing the various things that happened between the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north, the Seleucid emperor. The king of the south, the Ptolemaic emperor. When Alexander the Great died, he died without an heir to step into his shoes, and so instead his seven most trusted generals divvied up his empire. And for about 20 years, they kind of jockeyed back and forth, kind of, wrestled with each other, and fought with each other, and tried to trick each other, and cajole each other, and all kinds of things like that. It took about 20 years, but it settled out that there was about 4 kingdoms. So after Alexander died, his empire ended up being divided more or less into 4 Greek kingdoms. That his successor generals were ruling as kings. One of those was Seleucid, or Seleucus, who then became the one who started the Seleucid Empire, the king of the north. One of them was Ptolemy, who ruled out of Egypt, and that became the Ptolemaic Empire. And the last ruler, this is just a little aside, right? Does anyone know who was the last Ptolemaic ruler in that line? Second clue? Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the last heir of the Ptolemaic line. When she died, the line died out. So, that's where we're dealing with in the framework of things. Now, in 11 and 12, what's important about this is not only just that it gives this prophetic look ahead into exactly what's going to be happening between the king of the north and the south. Seleucid in the north, Ptolemy in the south. They kept on fighting with each other, and because in between those two is Israel, that's why it's so much of so much interest to Daniel. But those go back and forth, and the thing that's cool about that is in the midst of talking about that period of time, when he gets up to Antiochus Epiphanes, and that happens around verse number 21 in chapter 11, he starts talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. and starts developing that. And then all of a sudden, in around verse 36, he's still talking about, it looks like the same thing going on, but whereas everything before that verse happened in history, nothing in that verse happened in history. So you have this dividing line, where before it, everything came to pass in history, and after it, none of it's come to pass. And that's the part that's before it, right before it ends, it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. But when it gets to the spot in talking about him, where what it's describing is not about Antiochus, the model of the Antichrist, but talking about the actual Antichrist who will come later, it switches to talking about him. And so you start talking about the Antichrist in that particular place in Daniel chapter 11, and that continues into Daniel chapter 12 until that subject matter ends. And, that's the book of Daniel. So, having said all that, you still with me? All right. Having said all that, I didn't plug this thing in. Well, you can't expect things to work if you don't plug them in, right? All right. Now, there we go. Now, in talking about Daniel. Now, we talked a little bit about Daniel as a person last time we were together. I'm not going to revisit that at all. He was exiled to Babylon in 605 BC. He was, some of the first group of people that were exiled to Babylon was relatively small, and it was basically very elite people, basically hostages, really, when you think about it. And he was amongst those, was taken to Babylon as just a teenager at most. He was no older than 15, maybe even a bit younger. And he lived till about 536. We're not really, his death isn't really reported. It's just that his prophecy stopped at a certain time, and you got to figure he died sometime thereafter. So we'll just arbitrarily pick a date that is reasonable, 536 BC. Now, what are some of the major prophetic revelations of Daniel? Well, we hit some of those on our way in, but he was the one who basically spelled out what was going on in history from that point to the time when the Messiah would come. And as we were just mentioning in Daniel chapter 11 and moving into Daniel chapter 12, even going further than that, and dealing with the Antichrist and ultimately his demise when Christ returns. So he covered some big time things. Now, he said that things would go in this progression. From Babylon, that's where he was at the time when he was taken. In 539 BC, Babylon was conquered by Persia. And so in 539 BC, the next kingdom came up, and Daniel, almost as smooth as silk, went from serving high in the government of Babylon to serving high in the government of Persia, which is, that's pretty cool. Persia ruled for a while, and then it gave way to Greece, specifically to Alexander the Great. Now, you might wonder why only these nations, only these kingdoms are mentioned. Remember, when it comes to eschatological prophecy, what's the only thing that matters? The Jews. Jews are the only thing that matter. Why? They're God's chosen people, not just, to have these people and for these people to have God, but they're God's chosen people to do His work in the earth. All right? That's where all of the prophecy has come from. That's why we know about God, what we know about God. That's where the Messiah has come from. Everything worked through the Jews. Okay, so these are the nations that ruled over the Jews. You say, well, why does it end at Rome? We have a lot of history, and a lot of nations, a lot of kingdoms have ruled over Jews since then. And I would say to you just this: they haven't ruled over the Jews as a people. If you recall, Babylon came in and conquered the Jews in their homeland. They besieged their cities, destroyed Jerusalem, and then, in 3 successive waves, 605, 597, 586, they actually transported the populace of Judah out of the land and into Babylon. Okay, so that's not just, having a bunch of Jews happening to live in your kingdom. That's something more. They've actually excised the Jewish nation and taken the remnant, if you will, to Babylon. Persia took over that. When Persia defeated the Babylonians in 539, this is Cyrus the Great, of course, when he defeated the Babylonians in 539 BC, he did the same thing. I mean, he basically inherited this group of people that were, excised out of their homeland and brought in mass to Babylon. So that's why he's in there. Now, you think about what happened under his reign. He allowed the Jews to go home. Under Cyrus and under Xerxes and Artaxerxes and the various other kinds of rulers that were part of the Persian Empire, the Jews first managed to get their temple built. Eventually, they were allowed to go back and build the walls of Jerusalem and build back up the city. Thousands of them actually returned in the Persian reign back to their ancestral home in Israel. So you have, during the Persian reign, you had the Jews actually more or less moving out of being exiled and being dominated in that way to be returning back to their own land and to their own space, to Jerusalem, building their temple again and beginning to be, Israel, to be the people of God. In the 300s BC, Alexander comes flying out of Greece, and he basically he goes and defeats Egypt. He goes across the areas north of Israel, defeating the Persians. He just continues going, sweeping around in places that you shouldn't even necessarily sweep, but Alexander just, he did what he wanted to do, basically. He ended up going into the far climes of what we would consider Central Asia in our day. He got as far as like the Indus Valley, that would be Pakistan. He got up into places that we would call Iran, and he conquered virtually everywhere until he got to the Indus Valley and ran into an elephant army, and that basically got the best of him. But part of what he did in taking over all that land was he basically was in control of the Holy Land. Now he didn't go to Jerusalem and lay siege to it or anything else like that, but he did, just by his sweeping movements of his army, take over those who had Israel as a vassal state. So Alexander, by conquest, took over the Jews in their homeland. He didn't care too much about it, and like I say, he died in Babylon 333 BC, if my memory serves correct. So he didn't get much of a chance to do a whole lot with them. But his successor kingdoms, the Seleucids in the north, the Ptolemies in Egypt in the south, they kept on like using Israel as a tug of war rope. Back and forth it would go. And they more or less kept on, maybe were ping pong matches, another way of looking at it. They basically passed back and forth control of the Jews and Israel throughout all that time. So that's why Greece is in there. And then finally, what happened under the Roman general Pompey, and he basically came into the Middle East and snatched up a bunch of pieces of this and that for the Roman Empire. Part of what he snatched up was what the Seleucids held in the Holy Lands. And so Rome ended up being the governor, the government of Israel and the Jews. So that's why these four successions of nations are named. It's not because there wasn't anything else going on. It's because these are four nations in a row that had control over the Jewish people. And in eschatology, it's all about what's happening with the Jews. And so it only makes sense that this is the concentration and the fixation of prophecy. Now, in talking about the succession of nations that take over the Jews, there's a couple of interesting details that come out that we want to visit here for just a second. Let's talk about the most interesting aspect of this. Now, Greece is interesting because of Antiochus Epiphanes. We'll come back to that. But Rome is interesting because Rome is basically where we're at now. Say, no, Rome was destroyed in 476 AD. You're nuts, Pastor. I would say, well, that's only the western part. I could get away with saying, that you had an eastern part. But that really doesn't matter. What really matters when it comes to Rome is Rome was the power, having had the Jews under their sovereignty. Rome was the power that dispersed them to the place where no other governments mattered. Because when Rome dispersed the Jews, they dispersed them hither and yon, and nobody basically received the Jews en masse. But ultimately, in 135 AD, the Jews were kicked not only out of the environs of Jerusalem, they had been kicked out of there for a little while, but now they were kicked out of the environs of Judah, the Holy Land. And so, under Roman occupation, under Roman governance, the Jews were dispersed. And we call that the diaspora. They were kicked out because they rebelled in 67. That led to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. They rebelled again. They rebelled again in 135. And finally, at that point in time, enough was enough. Too much trouble. You either get killed, you get sold into slavery, or you just get sent away, hither and yon. And that's what happened to the Jews under Rome. So the reason that this all ends with Rome and why Rome is so important is because it was under Rome that the diaspora began. And so basically you have, if in a matter of speaking, you have this kind of pregnant pause historically, where the Roman Empire was responsible for sending the Jews all across the globe. Is there any power that can do something about that? Well, none was mentioned. I mean, Daniel doesn't mention anyone past Rome. Daniel is the heart and soul of this. I would even say that you don't really get a clue of anyone else from the Olivet Discourse. You really don't get a clue of anyone else in the book of Revelation. It's almost like when the Jews got dispersed from their homeland that last time, that kind of like put a hold on what was going on with the Jews. And that's the way I see it. It's almost like a pause button got pressed in the recorder of eschatological prophecy. And it's not going to be pressed again until this diaspora ends, until the Jews come back. Now, if they went out under the Roman Empire, there's a thought, it seems to make sense to me, that you would expect them to come back under a Roman Empire. And that's for the most part what happened. It happened in a very difficult way, but under the leadership, starting in World War I, first of the British Empire, and then of other Europeans, and what would we call them if we took their roots back and back and back and back and back? If you were looking at who was governing England, and you kept on going back, where would you eventually end up? You basically end up back in the days of the Roman Empire, because Britain was a Roman colony. Okay, it was a Roman province. And so what you had, starting with World War I, was a European effort to try to deal with the Jews. And when I say European, what I really mean is a Roman effort to deal with the Jews. The vestiges of the Roman Empire in its latest permutation, perhaps you would look at it as, in 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration being signed by the Secretary of State in the British Empire, named Balfour, interestingly enough. This declaration said that Israel was the national home of the Jews, and that they should have the right to go back and live as if that was so. So basically what you had in the Balfour Declaration was the ending of the diaspora. That which Well, maybe I should say this just so you see the connection. Think, you understand what who was the most famous of all the Roman emperors? Adrian went to England, made a wall. Constantine. All right. Constantine is famous for a number of reasons. Number one, he made Christianity tolerated before it was persecuted. Constantine came to power in 312, and Christianity became tolerated. The persecution was over. And it had gotten pretty severe under Diocletian and Decius before. So this was, under Constantine, it became legal to be a Christian. You were allowed to be a Christian, no persecution anymore. Under his grandson, it became the religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity did. So Constantine was the one who kind of pushed all that in that direction. And the other thing that he did that was remarkable and very historical, he divided the Roman Empire in two. He divided into the Western Empire, he divided into the Eastern Empire. Now the Western Empire they just called the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire ended up, for the most part, if you ever were reading in history books, it'll be called the Byzantium Empire, or Byzantium, just that word. It's because when Constantine did that, when he came to power, he decided to move the capital for the entire shebang to the east. And he moved it to a town that was called Byzantium. This town was in what's today Turkey, in the area that is famous for the city of Istanbul today, which is nothing more than a Turkish alliteration of Constantinople. Changed the name to Constantinople, and that became the capital of the Roman Empire. Both parts, but I mean the major one. And when the Roman Empire fell in the west, it continued on in the east. The Byzantium Empire continued, the Byzantine Empire continued right up until 1451, 1454. That's when finally the Turks were able to defeat them once and for all. They had been chipping away, the Muslims first and then later on the Turks. But I say all that to say this, is that when you think about the connections that are being placed here to Rome, you need to remember a couple things. Constantine in England, that gets you more or less to understanding the connection to the Balfour Declaration and why that's so important. And the other thing is remembering Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, right? That's a very important thing to remember as we go on talking about this. All right. So anyhow, what else is important about Rome? Are you still with me? What else is important about Rome? Well, some of the things that we were told in the various portions of Daniel that we touched on a little bit when we were doing that bit of a summary was that this Roman world, the Fourth Empire that's coming along, that it would ultimately end up in 10 toes, a foot and toes, but in Daniel chapter 2 it doesn't tell you that there's 10 toes. It just tells you toes and feet. But how many toes are on a foot?
6.
5. But there's 5, right? And so you have 2 feet and you have 10 toes. And why is that so interesting and important? Well, what happened to the Roman Empire? Divided into 2. And then the toes, that really connects later on with this concept here that we'll run into a little bit later on in Romans chapter 7, 10 horns. That represents ultimately this empire that comes together in the very last days of this age and gives the Antichrist power. So, very important bits and pieces of imagery and symbology that you have kind of connected to each other in different ways. It's like you're reading one chapter of Daniel and you're reading something and you know, okay, I understand that. These things mean this. This is what this probably is referring to. Then you get to another chapter and you have totally different imagery. But it's the same story. It's really not different story, it's the same story. And so you have that even with things like 10 toes in Daniel chapter 2 and 10 horns in Daniel chapter 7. So this 10 toes, this 10 horns, that actually will end up representing the last empire that comes in this age. When I say this age, I mean before Jesus comes back and rules in Jerusalem. They will be the last empire that has anything to do with Israel. Right? Where did their roots come from? Well, they came from the Roman Empire. We saw some of that already, location-wise and reaching back to England. That's a little more tenuous, but it's interesting that it's there nonetheless. But it also has connections to the Greeks, and we'll see that in just a second as well. So Rome does that. Even though it stopped such a long time ago, the fact of the matter is, it's basically left seeds in the ground that are going to sprout and come into importance at the very end of time. 10 toes, 10 horns. All right, and then also we learned, and this is in Daniel, these numbers here represent parts of the book of Daniel. I didn't want to write Daniel every time, so if you're taking notes and wondering what those numbers are, they're citations, chapter citations, and verse citations in the book of Daniel. And then it talks about Christ. In that vision, in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel explains that while you get down to the bottom of, because he's more or less looking at this statue from the top and working his way down descriptively to the bottom, and he gets to the bottom, he's describing there the fourth empire, the Roman Empire. He gets down to the toes, and he's describing the toes. And when he gets to that place, he says that this stone, this stone is hurled from the heavens and comes and smashes the feet of this statue, and then becomes a mighty mountain that fills the whole earth. And so, what was going on there? You were getting a location prophetically in time for when the Messiah would come. The Messiah was not going to come during Babylon's reign, not during Persia's reign, not during Greece's reign, but during Rome's reign, and not ancient Rome, but in the revived Rome. Remember I just talked about seeds that were sprout later on? In that age, you were going to get the ultimate end of these things at the hands of the Messiah. Now, the interesting thing about that is that we all know that Jesus came twice. He came once during the Roman Empire anciently. When he comes back, he's coming back during the 10 toes, during the 10 horns. Right? So you get a really efficient use of prophetic revelation here. This mountain reflects not only the fact that Jesus set off an evangelistic mission that is meant to cover the whole earth, but ultimately, he's coming back in person again and will reign and rule in Jerusalem, ruling with a rod of iron over all the earth. And it's there in Rome. So, that's this part. We'll go into this things. We're talking about major prophetic revelations continued in the book of Daniel. I said we'd talk about the Greek period. That's what we're going to do right now. Now, the Greek period is found in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11. Those are the places in Daniel where the Greek period of rule over the Jewish people is highlighted. What is so special about those times? In Daniel chapter 7, when Daniel is talking about the vision there of 4 different beasts and the 10 horns coming out of the 4th beast, and he mentions a little horn coming out amongst the 10 in that particular time, and it ends up breaking off three other horns and taking over things. In Daniel chapter 8, he uses basically the same symbology, but the weird thing about it, and the thing that puzzled me for years when I was young, trying to understand this, was that you had the same imagery used, but it couldn't possibly mean the same thing. Because in Daniel chapter 7, when this image of the little horn is introduced, it's definitely talking about the Roman time. It's definitely talking about 10 horns time. But when you get to Daniel chapter 8 and talks about the little horns, you are explicitly dealing with Alexander and the Greeks. You're talking about the Greek world. And here comes a little horn in the midst of what's going on with the horns on the goat. And to do about this? It's such a weird, bizarre thing to occur. Well, what it's talking about is actually two different people who are fulfilling, in some respect, the same role. One of those roles is to come to the fore and to demonstrate or to prove the model, to be a prototype, to be an antitype. Right? That was Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, he was a Greek and he came out of the Greek world. And if you ever read Maccabees 1 through 4 and are interested in any of the history of that period of time, that's what that's all about. The Jewish celebration of Hanukkah is all about his defeat. When the Jews rebelled under the Maccabees, they rebelled against Antiochus Epiphanes, and when they finally had retaken Jerusalem and they had cleansed the temple, and they were getting ready to start Jewish activities again in a newly cleansed and sanctified temple, they didn't have enough oil for the candles. And of course, there was a very special recipe given for that back in Leviticus, and you were not allowed to use it for anything else, any of the various oils and whatnot they used in the temple. And so they only had a little bit before they would be, having more be produced according to the code. And so the miracle of Hanukkah was that little supply ended up lasting 8 days instead of like 1. So if you're ever wondering where Hanukkah came from and all that kind of stuff, it came from the defeat of Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the model of the Antichrist. He came forth during the Greek period as a Seleucid ruler, king of the north. And what he did that was so exceptional as far as being a model is that he acted specifically against the Jews. He was destroying scriptures. He was prohibiting the brisk. He was acting in a unholy way to the temple. He put an idol of Zeus in the temple. He actually sacrificed a pig on the altar, which, if you're familiar with Jewish holiness codes, these are like the worst possible things that could happen in the temple. And this is for Jews that had been exiled for how badly they had handled all of this before. And yet under Antiochus Epiphanes, all of these various things were happening that just caused them to say, enough, no more, we can't take this, we're going to fight. They did under the Maccabees. They defeated Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, he wasn't defeated from his throne, right? He was not defeated from his throne in his Seleucid kingdom. He was just basically, he lost control of Judah, which became an independent nation from him. And so, being defeated, that is what started Hanukkah. And I say all that to say this, is that is the that is all about what happens here. The little horn mentioned in Daniel chapter 8, not the same little horn in Daniel chapter 7. The difference, the little horn mentioned in Daniel chapter 8 comes out of the Greek realm, and he was Antiochus Epiphanes. Right? That prophecy has been fulfilled. The only thing that's left with any gas in it in that prophecy is what it models for the ultimate Antichrist. Okay? That's out of Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 7, the little horn is the Antichrist. The Antichrist. So the little horn in Daniel chapter 7, coming out of the Roman period, coming out of 10 horns, 10 toes, that's the final Antichrist. That's the Antichrist of note. That's the Antichrist that Christ defeats when he returns to the earth. Okay, and that's in the Roman period. Daniel chapter 2, verses 39 to 45, talk about this 10-horned beast. The 10-horned beast is interesting as far as the imagery for this reason. Horn means either king or government power. So when you see horns used in prophetic imagery, it's not talking about just horns, antlers, or things of that nature. It's actually a veiled reference to governmental authority, kingliness, that kind of thing, authoritative power. And so the 10 horns, the 10-horned beast coming out of the Roman realm is going to be a confederation, a singularity, if you will, that's made up of 10 distinct kingdoms, 10 distinct horns, and those 10 distinct kingdoms, 10 distinct horns, end up giving power to the Antichrist. Right? And so in Daniel, we learn all about the model in Antiochus Epiphanes, Daniel chapter 8. We also learn about the fulfillment in Daniel chapter 7. All right? We also take that to Daniel chapter 11, and in the first part of Daniel chapter 11, up to verse number 36, that's all Greek. It's all Greek, and it's about the little horn, Daniel chapter 8. It's all about what leads up to Antiochus Epiphanes. But once you get up to the model, when it breaks from things that he modeled to things that have not been modeled yet or have not been fulfilled yet, you break. You're now into the Roman world, different little horn now. You were with Antiochus Epiphanes, that little horn, Daniel chapter 8, but now, starting with verse number 36, you're stepping into the realm of little horn, Daniel chapter 7, Roman realm, final Antichrist. Does that make sense? Okay. King of the King of the North is basically the moniker that Antiochus Epiphanes is known by in the Scripture in Daniel, and when we get to the Revelation, we're talking about that. We'll talk about a kingdom that once was, and this is in the days of John the Apostle, 95 AD is generally the date that's accepted for the vision of Revelation. In 95 AD, in the midst of that revelation, in talking about the kingdom of the Antichrist, it talks about a kingdom that once was, now is not, and will be again. Now, the worst part about that particular thing in the Scripture is that most interpreters try to tell us that the Roman Empire is going to be revived at the end of time, and that is where the Antichrist is coming from. The toes, the horns, they spring from the Roman Empire, but they're not synonymous with the Roman Empire. They're not the same one and the same thing. In fact, that little line tells you that it can't be the Roman Empire, because what empire still was in 95 AD? And it was still one in 95 AD. The Roman Empire. In fact, you were just getting to the height of Roman power in 95 AD. They say that the height of Roman power occurred, someplace between them and maybe Marcus Aurelius in the late 180s. But you're just getting into the strength of what the Roman Empire was going to be and would be. And John is talking, right at the beginning of that particular period, and he says, it now is not. So when we talk about the combination of the King of the North and the little horn and all this kind of thing, the thing that really comes out of that is just this, is that the Antichrist is not going to come out of a place associated with Rome that's in the West. He's not coming from England. He's not coming from France. He's not coming from Belgium. He's not coming from Spain. He's not coming from Italy. He's not coming from anywhere along North Africa. He's not coming from Israel. I know some people think that, but that's wrong. He's not coming from any of those places. He is going to come from the place where the little horn, Daniel chapter 8, and the little horn, Daniel chapter 7, where their territories cross paths. You with me? the image of the Antichrist as the king of the north, that's what's being revived. So if you're looking for where you're going to find the Antichrist, he's going to have to, in some sense, fit the model of the king of the north. Now I want to just do this for you. Oh, that did not come out nearly as clear as I was hoping that it would. Let's see if we can do anything about that. Okay, not really. All right, can you see that well enough? I'm late already, so we'll finish this up quickly and pick it up again next time we're together. This area in this color is the Seleucid Empire as it began. Now, shortly after it was in place, this whole part fell off. In fact, even down into here. That all basically reverted back to Parthian and Persian influence, and it was lost to the Seleucids thereafter. So for the most part, the Seleucid Empire, when you talk about it, is this segment right over here. If we would, drawing maps or drawing boundary lines on this map today, we have Iraq right here, we have Syria right here, we have Lebanon right here, we have Turkey right here. It says Armenia, but Armenia is now just a little tiny bit up here. This, for the most part, right in there is all Turkey. Okay? That's what we're talking about. That's the Seleucid Empire, that's the king of the north. So when we look for the king of the north, the figure that the scriptures tell us to look for, the thing that makes sense when the Apostle John says that it was a kingdom that was, the Seleucid Empire was not 95 AD. It had been earlier, but it was no longer. Right? It had fallen apart. Pompey. All right? So it no longer was. But it will be again. Interesting thing. When we look at this realm here that's the king of the north, we are told in various places some other areas that are going to be attached to this to make up the 10 horns. So for instance, Egypt is named. The Sudan is named. It's called Cush. Some interpreters will say Cush is Ethiopia. That's actually not right. Ethiopia or Cush refers to the Nubians. That's really the Sudan. So that's right over here. Libya is mentioned. That's right there. Okay. Saudi Arabia is specifically excluded. So is Jordan. Turkey is right here. It's part of the realm of the Seleucids. Greece is right here. They're mentioned. All right. Cyprus is not mentioned. It's right in there. It's green, so it doesn't show up. It's not mentioned, but it seems to be in the news today, so it might be part of the play that's going on. And you have a couple of other Islamic states over in this area, like Bosnia. And then, of course, in the news over the last year has been Azerbaijan, right over here. This is the places in the Bible that name the kings that will be part of this alliance in the end. And we'll get to those. But guess where they are? They're the ones I just showed you. So when we talk about something coming back alive that was not at the time of John, the Roman Empire was all this and it was all in place. But the thing that wasn't in place anymore was the Seleucid realm, the king of the north in particular. And when you look at Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, Lebanon, what's interesting about that? What did it say in Daniel chapter 7? 3 horns are broken out by the little horn. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. Guess where Turkey has troops right now? Syria, Iraq, and guess where they're talking about putting troops? If they need to, Lebanon. Interesting, is it not? So anyhow, if we go back to this slide right here, you notice this line right here. I went and did the unspeakable. I just named my best guess of who the Antichrist is. Recep Erdogan, the so-called president of Turkey. I tell you what, if he's not the Antichrist won't look like anymore like anybody else. The right place, doing the right things, messing with the right people. And if that's true, and I think it well could be, what does that mean about where we are right now?